Hello everyone. Today I've got a brand new series of spine-chilling horror stories for you. I'm really curious to know which corner of the world you're listening from. Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get started. A few months ago, I rented an Airbnb in a small, remote town, hoping for a quiet weekend getaway. The host had great reviews, and the house looked clean and cozy. It was a two-story cottage, simply furnished, but with all the essentials. The host mentioned in a message that the house had a security system, including cameras at the front door and in the living room, which were there to ensure guests' safety. He emphasized that the cameras were only in public spaces and wouldn't invade privacy. I didn't think much of it. Many rentals have such setups nowadays. The first day went smoothly. I spent most of the day out, and when I got back, it was late and I was exhausted, so I fell asleep right away. The next day, the weather was gloomy, and I decided to stay in and relax, watching TV and cooking. The house was quiet, with only the occasional sound of wind and leaves rustling outside. I felt a bit lonely, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, by the evening, things started to get strange. While I was sitting on the couch watching TV, I suddenly heard a soft thud coming from upstairs. I frowned, feeling my stomach clench slightly. The house was only one story. There shouldn't have been any noise from above. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe the wind had knocked something over, but a sense of unease began creeping in. I walked to the hallway, looked up at the ceiling, and listened. It was quiet again for a few minutes, and I convinced myself it must have been nothing. I returned to the couch and resumed watching TV. About half an hour later, there was another thud, louder this time, like something heavy striking the wooden floor. My hand jerked, almost dropping the remote. I stood up, listening intently, but the sound had stopped once again. All the doors and windows were securely closed. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I told myself it was just an old house making noise, maybe the wooden floorboards creaking. But for some reason, the unsettling feeling only deepened, as though something unseen was wandering through the house. To ease my nerves, I decided to check the house. I walked through every room, finding all the doors and windows securely locked, with no sign of anything unusual. The kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom all appeared just as they had before. I laughed at myself, thinking I was being overly paranoid. That night, I suddenly remembered the cameras the host had mentioned and thought I should check the footage, just to reassure myself that everything was fine. The host had given me access to the security system, so I logged in on my phone to check it out. Everything seemed normal. The camera at the front door had captured a few animals passing by, and the living room footage showed me moving around during the day. But when I scrolled back to the previous night's footage, things started to feel really wrong. At around 3 a.m., the camera captured something disturbing. I had already gone to bed by then, but in the footage, a shadowy figure appeared in the living room. It looked like a man wearing a long, loose coat, standing in the center of the room, facing my bedroom door. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity, probably close to 10 minutes. A chill ran down my spine. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. But when I replayed the footage, the figure was still there, standing in the same spot, almost blending into the darkness of the night. Then slowly, the figure began to fade, not walk away, but simply dissolve into the air, like it was being swallowed by mist. The footage ended with no other signs of movement in or out of the house. I panicked and immediately got up to check the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything was perfectly intact. The doors were locked, and the windows were tightly shut, with no signs of forced entry. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was probably a glitch in the camera or some kind of error in the recording. But the figure had seemed too real to be a simple technical issue. The uneasiness grew. I called the host right away to ask if the security cameras had ever malfunctioned before. His tone was calm, almost dismissive. He assured me that the cameras had always worked perfectly and that no previous guests had reported anything strange. He also tried to reassure me that it could have been a trick of the light or a shadow the camera had picked up at night. I hung up the phone, trying to believe his explanation, but the fear in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I barely slept, convinced that unseen eyes were watching me in the dark. Every time the wind brushed the curtains or the furniture creaked, I jolted awake, nerves on edge. By the next morning, I couldn't stand the oppressive atmosphere anymore and decided to leave early. I packed my things in a rush, locked the house, and placed the keys back in the lockbox. As I left, I couldn't help but glance back at the living room window, the same window where I had seen that eerie figure in the footage. A heavy feeling settled over me as I walked away. I told my friends about the experience, and they all tried to comfort me, saying it was probably just my imagination running wild in a strange place. But even now, the image of that shadowy figure standing still in the living room, staring at my bedroom door, lingers in my mind. Every time I think about it, a cold sweat breaks out on my back. Since then, I haven't contacted the host again, and there are no negative reviews about the house on Airbnb. I don't know if other guests have experienced the same thing or if it was just some bizarre, isolated incident. All I know is that I'm grateful nothing worse happened. Yet the figure I saw on that camera continues to haunt me, even though I never saw it again. It was a solo trip. After finishing a busy stretch of work, I decided to take a few days off to relax. Not wanting to stay at a hotel, I chose to rent an apartment through Airbnb. The place was in the suburbs, not far from the city, but quiet and peaceful. The host had excellent reviews, and the apartment looked both clean and modern. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind by myself for a few days. When I arrived, the host gave me detailed check-in instructions and told me the key was in a lockbox by the door. The apartment wasn't very big, but it felt cozy and well-furnished. As I walked in, I looked around. The living room had a comfy couch, some modern art hung on the walls. The kitchen was fully equipped, and the bedroom had a bed that looked incredibly comfortable. The host had even left some snacks and bottled water on the table, making a nice first impression. The first night went by uneventfully. I cooked myself dinner using the kitchen supplies the host provided, took a long shower, and felt completely relaxed. By nighttime, I was tired and went to bed early, feeling content with how smoothly everything was going. But just after midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was coming from the living room, like someone was quietly moving furniture or walking across the floor. Still half asleep, I sat up in bed, my heart racing a little. The sound wasn't loud, but in the dead of night, it felt unnervingly clear. I immediately tensed up. I was alone in the apartment, and I distinctly remembered locking the doors and windows before going to bed. Could it be a small animal? Or maybe the host coming back for something? 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. I slowly got out of bed, careful not to make any noise. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial an emergency number, but then I hesitated. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the house settling or some noise outside. I didn't want to panic without checking. I carefully opened the bedroom door and walked toward the living room, using my phone's flashlight to light the way. The living room was quiet. Nothing was out of place. The furniture was where I'd left it, and the windows were securely closed. I felt a bit foolish. I must have imagined it, or maybe it was just the wind. Relieved, I turned to head back to bed. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that froze me in place. There, standing outside the living room window, was the figure of a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in through the window. His face was hidden in the shadows, and I couldn't make out his expression, but I could feel his eyes locked on me. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands started shaking. I almost dropped my phone. The man didn't move. He just stood there, completely still, watching me. I had no idea how long he had been standing there or why he was even there in the first place. My first instinct was to call the police. I fumbled with my phone, dialing the emergency number, but the apartment was in a suburban area with poor reception. The call wouldn't go through, and the screen just kept loading. I wanted to run, but the door was directly in line with the window, and I would have to walk past him to get out. I didn't want to risk it. I had no idea what he was capable of. As I stood there in fear, unsure of what to do, the man finally moved. He didn't rush toward the window or try to break in. He He just slowly backed away, stepping further into the shadows until he disappeared completely into the night. I waited a few minutes to be sure he was really gone, then ran to the door, double-checking the locks. I also quickly pulled all the curtains shut, my hands trembling the entire time. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every few minutes, I would get up and peek through the curtains, terrified that he might return. I kept my phone in my hand, waiting for the signal to come back so I could call for help. But even by morning, I still couldn't get through. At dawn, I packed my bags and left the apartment as fast as I could. Before I left, I texted the host to let him know what had happened the previous night. His reply was quick, but he seemed shocked. "Are you sure you saw someone? I've never had anything like this happen before. The area is usually very safe." Even though the host tried to downplay the situation, I knew what I had seen. That night, a man had been standing outside my window, watching me until he slowly vanished into the darkness. After leaving the apartment, I felt an immense sense of relief, but the fear lingered inside me. To this day, I still have no idea who that man was or why he was standing outside the apartment. I often wonder what would have happened if he had tried to break in. While nothing worse happened that night, the memory of that man standing outside the window, completely still and staring, haunts me to this day. His eyes, hidden in the shadows, still appear in my nightmares, filled with an inexplicable, unsettling malice, as they quietly watched me from the darkness. It was a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I rented it through Airbnb to unwind and escape for a while. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest with no neighbors in sight, giving the feeling of complete isolation. While this setting brought a sense of peace, there was also an underlying unease in being so secluded. Nevertheless, I was looking forward to a quiet, comfortable getaway. I drove up to the cabin, and it looked exactly like the photos. Classic wooden structure with a spacious front porch and large windows. The host didn't meet me in person, but left the key in a lockbox by the door, so I let myself in easily. The interior was simple, but warm and tidy. The living room had a comfortable couch, an old-fashioned wooden rocking chair in the corner, and the bedroom was upstairs, offering a view of the surrounding forest through the large windows. During the day, I wandered around, taking in the natural beauty surrounding the cabin. Before it got dark, I returned inside to prepare dinner. Once night fell, the forest became eerily quiet, except for the occasional wind and rustling of leaves. After dinner, I settled on the couch with a book, planning to go to bed early. Around 8 p.m., I started hearing faint footsteps outside the cabin. They sounded like someone carefully walking through the dry leaves, slowly approaching. I stopped reading and listened closely. At first, I tried to convince myself it was probably just an animal. This was the forest, after all. But the footsteps were too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't the quick movements of a four-legged animal. It sounded like a person cautiously making their way toward the house. My heart began to race, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I got up, walked to the window, and gently pulled back the curtain to take a look outside. The darkness was thick, and all I could see were the outlines of trees faintly illuminated by the moon. I saw no movement, no signs of anyone outside. I reassured myself that it was probably nothing, maybe the wind rustling the leaves. I returned to the couch, trying to focus on my book again, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The footsteps started again, this time much clearer and closer, as if right outside the cabin. I shot up from the couch, grabbed my phone, and debated whether I should go outside with a flashlight to check. But deep down, I knew stepping out into the dark might be dangerous. Just as I was wrestling with whether or not to call the police, a loud bang shattered the silence. The sound of glass breaking filled the room. My heart nearly stopped. The window had been smashed, and shards of glass flew everywhere. I stumbled back, terrified. Through the broken window, I saw a tall figure standing outside, gripping a large wooden stick, staring coldly at me. A wave of panic surged through me. My mind went blank for a moment. The man didn't say anything, but without hesitation, he stepped through the shattered window and entered the cabin. The realization that I was no longer safe hit me hard. I grabbed my phone and sprinted toward the kitchen, desperately looking for a way out. "Call the police! Call the police now!" I muttered to myself as I fumbled with my phone, my hands trembling. I dialed 911 and the call connected. The operator picked up quickly, and I forced myself to speak as calmly as I could, explaining that someone had broken into the cabin. They assured me that officers were on their way immediately. I felt a small sense of relief, but knew I had to hold out until help arrived. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, hoping it would offer some protection. The man had already stepped fully into the living room, crunching glass beneath his boots. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. He started walking toward the kitchen, where I was hiding. I crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, my heart pounding louder with every step. He was just a few feet away, his slow movements filled with a menacing calm. I gripped the knife tightly, preparing myself for the worst. Suddenly, he stopped. Through the dim light, I could see him standing at the kitchen entrance, scanning the room. He seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of what to do next. His movements were methodical, but filled with an unspoken threat. He was so close, I could barely breathe. Then, without warning, he turned around and walked back toward the living room. He didn't search any further, but instead climbed back out through the broken window, disappearing into the night without a word. 10 minutes later, the police finally arrived. I was still huddled in the corner of the kitchen, gripping the knife so tightly my hand was cramping. It wasn't until they knocked and announced themselves that I dared to move. I opened the door to let them in, my whole body shaking. The officers searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but the man was long gone. They confirmed the broken window and told me they would investigate further. Only after they arrived did I feel the weight of the fear lift, though my legs were weak from the adrenaline wearing off. I didn't stay at the cabin that night. I left with the police, not willing to risk being alone again in such a vulnerable place. I contacted the host, telling him what had happened. He was shocked and promised to cooperate with the authorities. Once I was back in the city, the terror of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of that man standing outside the broken window, his cold, emotionless eyes fixed on me. What he wanted or why he decided to leave, I'll never know. Even now, thinking back to that night fills me with dread. The man's eyes, devoid of any warmth, made me feel like I was just prey, a part of some twisted game he was playing. While the police stopped anything worse from happening, I still can't forget the chilling sense of being hunted, his gaze lingering on me from the shadows. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.